And that's on it. He said it's a little good to see everyone out. As I walked out into the driveway this morning, first thing I said to myself was, hey, you haven't had to shovel all winter. You haven't had to shovel the roof. Don't start complaining.
You should shovel the driveway.
Yeah.
Well,
We've been lucky, that's for sure. Well, this morning we're starting into 2 Chronicles. And 2 Chronicles, as you know, is the 14th book now in the Old Testament that we've studied. And it's the 9th book in the section that's designated as the history section. And 2 Chronicles really just continues on with the narrative of 1 Chronicles. And if you remember, 1 Chronicles ended with the beginning of Solomon's reign, and 2 Chronicles opens in the same manner. It opens with Solomon's reign. And our first question that's asked is, in what ways does the history recorded in 2 Chronicles differ from the manner in which the history of Israel and Judah is recorded in 1st and 2nd Kings? You remember we had that thought question in 1st Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles really covers the period of history that is found in 2nd Kings, but with a little different tone. Much the same as I had just said the writer did with 1st Chronicles when he repeated the history of 1st and 2nd Samuel. If you remember, the former was written, 1st and 2nd Samuel were written from a moral point of view with a prophetic tone. And now we see here in 1st Chronicles, the writer presents his stories from a spiritual and a priestly point of view. Remember, we had talked about that, reminded ourselves that at this point in history, what's the nation of Israel doing? What are they?
They're in sin.
The which?
The children of Israel?
Yeah.
They're in sin. They're not following God.
Right, but
in Solomon.
Yeah.
Solomon, they're united. Like, it's United Kingdom. Maybe I'm not getting the question
Okay.
here.
No, but I mean, yeah, well, no, that's all right. But where are they leaving right now in our study? Where have they been for the last 70 years?
Captivity.
Right, right. And that, remember, we could understand and saw why the tone was a spiritual and from a priestly point of view. They're being reminded of their history, of their covenant with God. But 2 Chronicles covers the reign of Solomon in chapters 1 to 9, and then we come into the period of the divided kingdom, remember, in chapters 10 to 36, and then with the return from exile in verses 22 and 23 of chapters 36. So it covers that whole history from the time of Solomon till the return from captivity. And as always in our studies, we now look at the origin of 2 Chronicles by first looking at its title. And this is pretty much repeating a lot of what we just did with 1 Chronicles. But we made mention in our opening lesson of 1 Chronicles that the books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like Samuel and Kings, they were originally one volume, right? It was one book. But as always, when the Septuagint came along, the translators divided the book into two volumes. And as I thought about this, we've had this slide on continually now since Genesis. But the Septuagint is sometimes abbreviated with the LXX, and I wondered why is that? Well, the name is given to the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures. That's the Septuagint, but it had its origin in Alexandria, Egypt, and it was translated between 300 and 200 BC. And it was widely used at that time by the Hellenistic Jews. And this translation, the Greek translation, was produced really because many of the Jews that were spread throughout the empire at that time, they were beginning to lose their Hebrew language because they were living amongst other nations. And the process of translating the Hebrew to Greek also gave many non-Jews a glimpse into Judaism. And according to an ancient document called the Letter of, Aristes, it is believed that 70 to 72 Jewish scholars were commissioned during the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus in order to carry out this task of translation. So that is where the term Septuagint, meaning 70 in Latin, and the text is so named because it gives credit to those 70 scholars. I just thought that was kind of a side note, but it kind of helps us understand and see how many times the scriptures have been translated and into so many languages. And the Septuagint also really was a source of the Old Testament for early Christians during the first few centuries in A.D. Many early Christians spoke and read Greek, so they relied on the Septuagint translation for their understanding of the Old Testament. And then the Latin Vulgate, when this man, as your translations of other language, Euebus Hieronymus Sophronus, that was his name. Well, thankfully we know him as Jerome. And he completed the first Latin version of the scriptures, and he suggested that it might be called a chronicle of the entire divine history of Israel. And so this descriptive title has been carried over into our English versions of the Bible. And a little interesting note on Jerome was that he was born in northeast Italy, and there was no translation in the Latin language. And many spoke Latin, they couldn't read Hebrew or Greek. And then by the age of 29, he apparently was a pretty disciplined scholar, and and he devoted his life to the duties of piety and devotion in translating.
Just by that date, which may not be significant to a lot of people,
right?
But if Jerome translated that, the Catholic Church around that time, it comes along and says they gave the world the Bible. They did not. If Jerome translated the scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, into Latin, it existed.
Exactly.
And I didn't, like, as far as we think of, okay, did it exist in completion? Yes, it did. There were different copies of the Bible. That's what God had prophesied through Paul, that which was perfect was going to come. By that time, 3 centuries after the apostles, there were no spiritual gifts. The word had come. And if Jerome was there to translate it, that must mean it was there to be translated.
Exactly. That's a good point. It's interesting. I didn't realize that. It helps when you know your dates and times. But he was, apparently Jerome, he was preoccupied with secular learning. And he had a dream, he said. And that's what he was told in the dream. And So for the next several years, Jerome kind of lived a hermit's life in the Syrian desert and studying and transcribing the scriptures and mastering Hebrew. And he later became a secretary to Pope Damasus in 1382. But he was at that time probably one of the most renowned religious scholars in the world at that time. And so thus he translated the scriptures. I always find it interesting because, you know, we think the Bible has just always been here, what we have. But there's many languages and all kinds of scholars that have translated, which is a warning to us too, to be careful what we're reading and to always, make use of the scriptures of what God has promised, and maybe what we're finding now in some of these new translations, that we see where man is trying to lead us away from what God would have us understand. But next then in our origin is the author section, and kind of the same as in First Chronicles. Who is traditionally considered the author of Second Chronicles, and what evidence within the book supports this possibility? Can you remember who we thought traditionally is considered the author of First and Second Chronicles? Who? Ezra, right. Jewish tradition really credits the writing of the book to Ezra the priest and scribe. And if you remember, we looked at some descriptive phrases that were used in the book. And the ending verses of First Chronicles and Second Chronicles, actually, they're simply copies almost of the first verses in Ezra. And plus we looked at the fact that the book stresses the temple, stresses the priesthood, and the religious worship of Israel, which also leans kind of towards the credits of Ezra being who he was. And so with that bit of understanding, we ask the question, why is the author of Chronicles sometimes referred to today simply as a chronicler? Because we don't really know. And why do you think that is? Kind of goes with our last thoughts. Remember, we said that nowhere really in the book of First, Second Chronicles is Ezra given the credit, is he, of having been its author, nor does any other scripture ever address the subject. So many scholars simply refer to the writer as the chronicler, and that is just simply one who gives a record of events in order of time, in the order of the time that it was taking place. And so then, in our origin, we end with the date. And, our timeline, if you remember, right from the beginning of our study, always begins in 1 Kings 6:1. And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month that he began to build the house of the Lord. That is where we began our timeline through all our studies. And so we start, as always, in 966 BC. But remember, our dates, we're not standing firm on them. We're, within these years, it is really what we're looking at. And then in 966 BC, in the time of Solomon, he's erecting the temple. And then we move on to the captivity of Judah in 586 BC, being captured by Babylon. And then we move on to the ending of the Babylonian captivity. And now, the events in 2nd Chronicles, they don't go back as far as in 1st Chronicles. Can you remember where we, in 1st Chronicles, where did the history, how far back did the history go? Can you remember? How far back did the writer, did Ezra take us? Can you remember?
Oh, wait, well, it did go back to Adam.
Right, Jeremy. Yeah, it went all the way back. The chronicler took them all the way back to the beginning, to Adam. But here in 2nd Chronicles, he only goes back as far as the beginning reign of Solomon, and then he goes forward to the release from captivity. So then, in remembering, originally 1st and 2nd Chronicles were one book. Remember, in the beginning. So the time of writing then was the same as 1st Chronicles, and it simply, we think, was 450 BC, because they were both, it was one book. They weren't separated then. So roughly at that point in history. And the thoughts that we had mentioned of 1st Chronicles going back to Adam, we keep reminding ourselves what was the purpose for the writing of Chronicles. And it was to remind those that are leaving captivity that a lot of young people knowing nothing about Israel's history now, they need to be reminded. And so in the first book, we go right back to Adam, and the writer takes them through seeing God's covenant. They were God's covenant people from the beginning. And now in 2nd Chronicles, he relates, as we'll see later in our study, all the different kings from the time of Solomon forward. And so then now we look at the purpose of 2nd Chronicles, and we begin, of course, as always, with the historical purpose. I might have jumped ahead there in those few thoughts, but why does 2nd Chronicles emphasize, in order to remind the remnant of Judah of their unique spiritual heritage as God's covenant people? What do you think of that question? What does 2nd Chronicles emphasize? Mostly, in order to remind those leaving captivity. If you remember it,
I didn't know.
No,
I think it was James back there.
Right. Lays out the order. We'll see that a little later on. But it provides then the Jewish remnant who are now returning from Babylonian exile with a clear reminder, okay, of their spiritual heritage as God's covenant people. And it does this by presenting a historical record of its kings, of its priestly religious history. Remember, they're coming out of a world that has idols, has no thoughts really of the true God, of the creator of this world. They're being reminded now of the priestly religious history, beginning with King Solomon. That's where it starts in 2nd Chronicles. And the building of and the dedicating of the temple in Jerusalem, and the religious life of God's people, which was centered around it. And we find that in 2nd Chronicles 2 to chapter 7. Those chapters enforce all that. And it also reinforces the divinely appointed dynasty of David, okay, by reviewing the history of his royal line. They needed to be reminded of David, who David was, and his family. And the writer of 2 Chronicles, really and ultimately God, had a goal in mind for the remnant who were now leaving the years of captivity behind. And they're marching towards their homeland. And they were desperately, we can use that word, they were desperately in need of encouragement, you would think. Remember, they were the once glorious nation. And now they've been reduced to a tiny minority. They're nothing compared to what they were. And they were struggling, many would be struggling to understand their place. If we take a peek at this map, this is roughly the area of land that God had promised his people. But through their sins, they were taken from it, weren't they? That's the whole reason they lost their land. And had God's promises now, might they be thinking, had God's promises to Abraham and David been revoked because of their sins? Might they be thinking, was there a hope of reviving David's dynasty? Could Judaism survive without the temple? Because they have no temple. It was destroyed. And now they're coming back to their homeland and they know it's gone. Well, it certainly could, couldn't it? We know that. God's promises are God's promises. And that is the reason why the writer of Chronicles is reminding Israel of this, is reminding the remnant as they come back. They need to be reminded of who they are. And so we see this in actually in the doctrinal purpose of 2 Chronicles. The remnant needs to understand that God demanded proper worship in his prescribed place at that time. For them to live a blessed and a protected life, they needed to know that they had to maintain purity in the temple worship at that time, and the Levitical priesthood. Our writer aids their understanding. We'll turn to some passages here by pointing out the spiritual conduct of some of their more godly kings. He starts there with the godly kings. If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1. Chapter 1 verses 7 to 12. Let's maybe take a verse each. We'll start with Jeremy. We'll read from 7 to 12 in chapter 1.
In that night did God appear unto Solomon, and said unto him, Ask what I shall give you.
And Solomon said to God, You have shown great and steadfast love to David my father, and have made me king in his place.
Now, O Lord God, let your promise to David my father be established, for you have made me king over people like the dust over the earth in multitude.
Where are we? Sorry.
Now give me wisdom.
Or say second Chronicles.
Now give me wisdom and knowledge that I may go out and come in before this people. For who can judge this great people of yours?
First,
Second Chronicles 1:11.
1:11. Lord?
Then God said to Solomon, because this was in your heart, and you have not asked riches, wealth, or honor, or the life of your enemies, nor have you asked for a long life, but have asked wisdom and knowledge for yourselves, that you may judge my people over whom I have made you king.
And verse. Okay, thank you. In chapter 2 and verse 1 simply says, now Solomon decided to build a house for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself. Sometimes Solomon as king, he set a godly example for other kings, which is overlooked sometimes. We seem to always think of all the bad, which is good for us to meditate upon. But it's good for us. That's why I decided to read some of these verses of these kings. Solomon's attitude in the beginning is one to be matched. His desire, he asked God, you bless me with that kind of attitude. And, those are good examples for us, Jim.
In one sense, it required a lot of wisdom to ask for wisdom. In other words, he recognized that this doesn't tell us, but he was very young.
Yes.
When he became king, and he recognized that if he was to be a godly king, a strong king, it was going to be through God, and he lacked what he thought he lacked was wisdom, and so that's what he asked for. When we pray to God, let's examine ourselves and pray for what we think we lack, and God granted Solomon this because he chose wisely in one sense, like as far as to quote a movie, but he could have asked for so much more, and yet he asked for what the world would think was, why would you ask for all of this other things? He had his eyes on God, and he wanted to be a godly king, and God provided him that, and so much more.
Right, exactly. When you think about that, when we apply that to ourselves, to ask for wisdom, sometimes that's kind of hard because that affects our pride. Because we're admitting that we don't know all, we don't understand all. And it always seems with mankind that that's our biggest problem, is our pride. But we see here, as Jeremy says, and Solomon was king, and a young man at that. It might be pretty hard to ask for wisdom knowing, hey, I'm the king, I'm the ruler. But we see his desire in the beginning, and it's good to reflect upon that. And we see that it was interesting to know it. I maybe didn't write this down, but I thought about it as I was putting the lesson together. When he became king, we read in 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 37 to 38, in the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. That's in accordance with the verse that we start our timeline in. Solomon's beginning the temple here, and then in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished. The temple was built throughout all its parts and according to all its plans. So it says here, so it was 7 years in building it. Solomon went right to work when he became king, and he built the temple in 7 years. And then I found it interesting that chapter 7 and verse 1 says, now Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. But he built God's house first. That's just kind of a side point, but I found that interesting. Maybe as king, I might have built my own house first. But see, Solomon's attitude was, at that time, his heart was to serve God, and he knew the importance of the temple, and that was built first.
And you'll probably get to this later, but you can contrast that with his son's attitude towards wisdom. His son, Solomon, in his early days, if he had a question, would have consulted God and would have taken the advice of God. His son Rehoboam had advice, and he had good advice, but he didn't show wisdom. He lacked the wisdom that Solomon was given, and the results were disastrous because of it.
Mm-hmm. Completely the opposite,
Yeah.
wasn't it? With Rehoboam. I think, later on we touch a little bit on Rehoboam, but you're right, you see what a contrast. Dad sought out God's wisdom, and son, just completely the opposite. And then our second godly king, you turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verses 2 to 5. Where did we leave off our reading?
I think it's James.
James, it's your turn. You read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14, and Lisa, you could read 3 and 4, and then I'll go to Sandra for verse 5.
Is it 1 to 4?
Yeah, chapter 14.
1 and 2.
Oh, chapter 14, verses, we'll read verses 1 to 5.
So Abijah slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. And Asa his son reigned in his stead. In his days the land was quite in his days the land was quite for 10 years.
And verse 2.
And Asa did that which was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. For he took away the foreign altars and the high places, and brake down the pillars, and hew down the asherim.
Okay, and Lisa? Oh, sorry, 4 and 5. Okay, we see here Asa's commitment, don't we? His heart to God. Sandra, do you want to read chapter 15, verses 1 to 4?
And the Spirit of God came upon Azariah the son of Obed, and he went out to meet Asa and said unto him, Hear ye me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin, the Lord is with you, God is with you. And if you seek him, he will be found of you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. Now for a long season Israel hath been without the true God, and without a teaching priest, and without law. But when they are in their trouble, they turn unto the Lord God of Israel, and sought him, and he found them.
Okay, and in verse 8, Henry.
We ask for this verse, the prophet to courage, abominable idols for our land, and from the cities which destroy the altar of
I think that was it.
Okay, sorry. So remember in the beginning we were saying that these kings are being pointed out. The writer of Chronicles is pointing out these kings to those that are leaving captivity. And here we see the second king. Remember, Solomon we see ask for wisdom, and we see now here Asa, when he hears from the prophet, the prophecy, what's his attitude? He takes courage, doesn't he? He musters up his godly courage, and he removes all the idols out of Israel. Hearing those words, the people hearing them words, hearing how those kings were, would be strengthened. We're all that way when we hear of someone else that's willing to stand up, take courage, change their character. It encourages us, strengthens us. He also speaks of Jehoshaphat in chapter 17. Jehoshaphat does something interesting. Chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. 3 and 4. Cherry, do you want to do that, please? Jehoshaphat? Okay, so we see here the Lord's with Jehoshaphat, and why was that? Why was God with him?
He walked after David.
Right, Jim. Yeah, walked after David. He didn't seek out the idols, the Baals, and he followed God's commandments. And 2 minutes. That's a new one.
That's a little louder than usual.
Oh, I see, yeah. And then if you look down in verse 8 and 9, Jehoshaphat does this, verses 7 to 9. There's some tough names in there, but we see then in the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his officials. Okay? Jehoshaphat is sending his officials, Ben-Hail, Obadiah, Zechariah, Nathanael, Micaiah, to teach in the cities of Judah. It's interesting, isn't it? And with them, he sends the Levites, Shemaiah, Nathaniah. Let's just go through all them names, bypass them, and we'll go down to the end of 8. And with them, Elishama and Jehoram, the priests. And they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with them. And they went throughout all the cities of Judah and taught among the people. This was the king. He sends the priests, he sends his officials, and he sends them to do what? To teach. And he sends them, what are they teaching from? The book of the law. Reminders that Israel needs to hear. Well, okay, then we'll end our class there this morning, and we'll pick up next week where we leave